Hello, and welcome to the Citizens of Craft podcast, where we explore the objects we love, the reasons we love them, and the people who bring them to life. I'm your host, Megan Black. In my job as the director of the Canadian Crafts Federation, I have the absolute honor of meeting craftspeople from across Canada and beyond who dedicate their lives to the creation of artistic, skillful, and captivating objects. Woodworkers, glass sculptors, jewelers and potters, textile artists, fashion designers, furniture makers, and more. You name it, there's someone out there making it and making it well. These are the citizens of craft. They are masters in their own right, chasing techniques that have been in use for thousands of years and exploring new technologies that have just begun to push the boundaries of art. They create objects with meaning, history, and purpose, rejecting the mass-manufactured lifestyle of our time to capture something more authentic, something that fascinates, something that matters, something that tells the story of who we are. Join me as we explore that story through the 10 manifesto statements of the Citizens of Craft movement, from "You are not a lemming" to "Cookie cutter doesn't cut it" and "Vases are people too." We'll discuss these ideas and so much more by talking with the people who bring them to life, the Citizens of Craft. Hello, everyone, and thank you all for tuning in to the third episode of the Citizens of Craft podcast. We're shifting gears ever so slightly today, as our first two episodes paired together an artist and a curator. But for today's episode, we're speaking with another great artist who has a whole lot of academic experience and a collector who comes to craft from a completely different perspective. On one hand, we have the maker, and on the other hand, the getter, as she described herself to me not that long ago. Without further ado, I would like to welcome glass artist and Alberta College of Art and Design Associate Professor Natali Rodrigues, calling in from Calgary, and craft collector extraordinaire Hilary West, who is situated in Toronto. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, I really think it's interesting that we get to have these two very different perspectives together today, the artist and the collector, the maker and the appreciator, and the locations that you both connect with craft in, they definitely cross over in galleries and boutiques and the like. But the spaces that you personally engage with craft in most often, those truly differ. So let's start the conversation about those spaces specifically. So let's set the scene a little, if you will. Natali, I've got two questions to start you off with. Can you describe your surroundings right now, where you're calling in from today, and then also the place where you most often engage with craft?
So I'm talking to you right now from my house, and more specifically my living room. And I'm surrounded by objects and plants and a cat that is running around. He's actually just a kitten. And where I engage with craft the most is probably my house, but also the college itself. I'm pretty lucky to be able to work with very, very talented colleagues and some very talented students as well. And so it is, I basically think about craft from the moment I wake up till the moment I go to sleep.
And Hilary, can you do the same for us? Can you describe your current surroundings and then also the space that you most often engage with craft? What does that look like for you?
Alrighty. I'm in my house in sort of an open concept, little Victorian. I can look out the window, and around me I am surrounded by my treasures, which many of them are craft treasures. I'm looking over at a Lisa Kresge bird. I'm looking at lots of paintings. I have lots of stuff. And where I engage with craft, I'm so lucky. Well, in my house is one of them, but my friends' houses. I've got lots of friends, and not surprisingly, they kind of like what I like. And many of them are makers. And so they have really neat things in their houses. And I'm very, very fortunate that I live in a neighborhood which is full of people who make stuff, and the neighborhood itself is very creative. So here in Parkdale, I'm just surrounded by it.
Oh, wow. Lovely. Oh, I want to be in both of those spaces with you. I'm virtually there with you right now, but physically, it's great to hear the spaces that you're surrounded by. So let's talk a little bit about how you found yourself in those spaces. What first brought you to craft? And I'll start with Natali.
Well, I read the question that you sent us, and I think my answer surprised me in that when I was a little kid, I was always making things, tinkering, drawing, building things, learning how to knit. And it was really only, I guess, when I got to the college, when I started my undergraduate, that I really understood that what I needed to do was be a craftsperson, because that's what I already was. And over time, that's sort of just been reinforced. I think through making, I think through motion, and being able to do that is, I think, intrinsically important to me as a person, and always has been ever since I was a little kid. But I don't know if I knew it.
Until you came to the school, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
What would you say when you came to the school, when you were a student, or when you started to get a little bit more in depth into the craft practices specifically?
When I came as a student. So I got to ACA at the time when I was 24. I'd had a bunch of different kinds of jobs and never thought it possible. I never thought it was possible to go to art school. I didn't think that I had the skill. I had like a teacher in high school who was, let's just say, very dismissive and not supportive, and basically told me that I shouldn't ever do art again, and that I didn't have any facility for it, even though I'd spent, my parents were very generous in putting me into art classes and taking us to museums. And my mom's best friend is a ceramicist, as is her husband. And so we spent a lot of time with them as children. Mm-hmm. And so I was surrounded by makers as a kid. And so high school was a kind of death of that hope.
Oh.
And it was really my sister and my mother who secretly bought a couple of extended studies classes for me. And one day my sister said, "Get in the car." And I said, "Why?" And she's like, "Just get in the car, don't ask." So I got in the car, and there was like a portfolio in the back and a paper bag with snacks in it. And we drove to the university, and she's like, handed me a sheet of paper and said, "This is the room you're going to." And it was my first drawing class.
Wow.
And so it was through that experience, and then applying to art schools, getting into the ones that I had applied for, that was the moment. So the moment of me starting my path or my journey to being a craftsperson was that moment that my mom and my sister threw me in the car.
Thank goodness for the people who know us better than we know ourselves, right? I mean, you can hear one negative, dismissive comment from someone in a position of power when you're in a tender age like that, where you're trying to find your course and your future. And it can really hold you back from the potential that's there, because people don't necessarily see the value in this kind of education or in moving towards the arts as a career. So I'm so glad that your family persevered to help you down that path.
So am I, because I couldn't have imagined in high school how big my life could get, that I could have all of these experiences.
Definitely. Wow. So Hilary, you must have come from a very different starting point. What made you fall in love with craft?
Well, I think I've always been in love with craft. My family, I'm an Army brat. My family also traveled a lot. Well, with the military and things like that. And kind of a Victorian sensibility where when people travel, they pick up neat stuff from wherever it is that they've been. And so, and everything's crowded. You look at those Victorian households and it's like they're just stacked up with really neat curiosities. And I've always been surrounded with things like that. And then I guess when I was 13, we moved to the Middle East. We moved to Damascus. And we actually lived all over the place, including in Israel, because it was with the United Nations. And I went to the souks. And the Canadian dollar was just that much better than, you know, the local currency. So I had a lot of money, even as a 13-year-old, because of the exchange rate and stuff. Could buy my own things and had my own gold dealer, and I could see this. But you see original things when you go to the souks. Like the souks are the bazaars. So there was stuff there, and I've always been intrigued by it.
Wow, I have never heard of a 13-year-old who had their own gold dealer. That's certainly a first for me.
It was cheap.
What an interesting experience to have gone through something like that. From your perspective then, did someone or something specifically during that experience or that time in your life influence your love of craft? You were obviously surrounded by it in that traveling experience, but was there a particular moment or a particular experience that you can recall?
No, not in per se, because I've always been surrounded by it. Like my grandmother, she would make little books. She was not a home on the range kind of grandmother, not at all. But she did like to do the arts and things. And so she would make little books and make little songs, and she was quite intriguing. And my mom liked that kind of stuff too. So it's always been part of it. And so when did I start putting my money where my mouth was? It was when I had the money to do it. And then living in the Middle East, like going to the souks, whether it's in Jerusalem or in Damascus or in Beirut, whatever, is that I could actually put my money out. I couldn't afford it if I was in Canada. But when I was there, it's like, oh, I think I'll just get one. And I could.
Lovely. And you did.
Mm-hmm.
So, Natali, you also have had experiences in and outside of Canada as a part of your artistic career and in your youth. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your international perspective?
Yeah, so I grew up with two adventurers as parents, and I was born in Africa. My mother found her way from Germany to Africa by taking a steamer.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, there was like both my parents' stories are exciting and somewhat fairy tale like. My father was in the army in Kenya and was like the captain of the Guard of Honor for Jomo Kenyatta. And my mother was an anthropologist and worked with Richard Leakey in sort of the really early days of her career and the early days of his career.
I really had no idea that both of you, as both of our guests today, had connections for international travel through the UN. That's really interesting that is a connection between the two of you from completely different perspectives and experiences, of course. But that international perspective certainly leads into your experiences today.
Absolutely. And, both of our experiences having military families and families involved with the UN, I think really, for me personally, opened up a way of seeing the world and a way of interacting with the world that was greater than just being from Edmonton. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that I really, if I look back at my childhood, what I really appreciate about growing up in Edmonton was just how international a city it was, which I think most people would find a funny thing to hear. But the community that I grew up in was primarily Ukrainians, and Ukrainians that had found their roots in Canada for, 4 or 5 generations. It was also a very francophone community. So my sister, brother, and I went to a francophone school, like an elementary school. And so there was a kind of looking towards the history of Alberta and Canada, but also it was a community filled with immigrants, so that everyone, even the families, the Canadian families, all spoke a different language at home other than English.
Speaking of all these different places and going back to the different spaces where you're both engaging with craft specifically, and the histories that come from all of those experiences intertwined into your own experience, how we've come to these spaces, that really plays in well to the Citizens of Craft manifesto statement that we're focusing on for the theme of our conversation today. And that manifesto statement is, objects should inhabit, not intrude. You believe objects with personal, tactile histories engage with your world better than the anonymously mass-produced. Now, coming from those perspectives where you've got all kinds of different histories and all kinds of backgrounds, and you've seen the value in those objects from all across the world and how they connect with cultural experiences, I'm curious to know, what are your initial thoughts when you hear this statement, objects should inhabit, not intrude? And so what are your initial thoughts? But then also, would you say that applies to your own philosophies of making and collecting? And I'll start with you, Hilary.
Yes. The short answer is yes. And of course, I've got a long one. The whole idea of uniqueness, and actually having lived in different places and, been in different environments when you move around and things, is that you see a lot of different things, and different things can be intriguing. And when you're little and you've moved around, you're kind of released from a group mindset. I don't know. I'm just guessing, but where I went to school, like, in Beirut and things, other people were also moving around, and they all had different ways of thinking and looking at things. And so it wasn't like, oh, I like that because my best friend likes that. You have a new best friend, and it's like my best friend in Beirut was a Norwegian gal. And so like you just get a lot of different influences, and you get to make up your own mind because you're kind of a little on your own there.
And Natali, what were your first thoughts when you heard this statement?
I totally agree with it. One of the things that I think about when I think about crafted objects or handmade objects is that it is an expression of our profound humanity. If we look at burial goods, we're burying our dead with grave goods before we're Homo sapiens sapiens, right? Wow. And so this is something that is in our DNA and at the very core of who we are. And when you look at something that someone has made, if I think about my coffee mug in the morning, it is an expression of someone's hand, the shape of their hand, how it basically is the negative space of their grip. And for me, that's about me and someone else. I get to use something that someone else has made, and the objects that I've made then inhabit someone else's hands and their homes and their daily lives. And then the other thing is that, the handmade object or the crafted object is about the complexity of life and not about a kind of diminishment of the complexity of our world.
What do you mean by that? Not a diminishment of the complexity of our world? Well,
I think of, and I'm going to paraphrase one of my favorite craft authors these days. He talks a lot about the DNA of an object, so that within the object you can really see some of the cultural history of where it was made. Mm-hmm. You can see some of the assumptions around function of where it was made. And, the example he gives is a Japanese saw. That, Japanese saws cut on the draw rather than on the push, or maybe it's the other way around. I can never remember. But European saws cut in a specific way because they were used to make specific things. And the Japanese saws have other requirements. And that's why over the generations, they've evolved in these two very different ways. Right. And if I think about, Japanese or a Chinese teacup, it's about not only drinking, but the experience of the liquid in the cup. And it's the same thing if we look at the English teacup, or if we look at, the teacups in the Middle East, or even in India, where you can get a cup of chai on the railway line, and it is meant to be broken. It's disposable, but it's still made out of clay, and it's still made by someone. And so when I think about the objects that either I've collected or I've made, those are the things that are embedded in those things. Mm-hmm. And so you can't divorce the maker from the object.
Mm-hmm. And in craft, we often focus on the objects themselves because there's fascinating techniques that are used for how they're actually made. There's really beautiful, sometimes sublime, sometimes wild concepts that are expressed. And we, as the viewers, or from Natalie's perspective, often as the maker, we can't help but be intrigued by these things. These objects are the primary connecting point between us all. It's the reason that we're even talking in this conversation today. But I often feel, and you kind of alluded to this a little bit, that the bigger story that's told shines through the people that are behind those objects. And those are the people that we call the citizens of craft. So they bring this community to life. And I'm curious to know how you maybe connect with this idea of citizenship. We've kind of been walking around the cusp of this conversation so far, but I'm curious to know how you connect the idea of citizenship and how we all belong as a part of this diverse craft community. So, Hilary, do you want to talk a little bit about, from your perspective as a collector, how do you see yourself fitting into this whole citizenship of craft?
Yes, thank you for that. The way I see that, and to speak to what you have both been talking about in terms of the maker putting something within themselves, and they're putting their accidents, they're putting their inspiration and their insights, and actually almost things they do almost like their own fingerprints within any, within any artifact that they've got, which to the mass market, you can't, if you program something to come off an assembly line, there can never be I think I'm just going to stick my finger in here just to do it slightly differently. And the idea that I think that connects me with them is that I feel that in a weird way, you almost get a piece of the person. You get I've got these crazy mugs and cups by Lee Clark and Yolande Clark. Actually, they're both from down east, and they're crazy. But it's all like it came out of their brain, and all of a sudden, I have a little bit of that, and I can look at that, and I can reflect on that, and I can think about what it is, the creativity, the difference of thinking that made them come up with those things. And I feel that's what's so exciting for me when I kind of almost want to buy some of that inspiration. I know it sort of sounds cheesy that way, but it's very exciting when I look at it and go, oh my goodness, and there's this hand, or there's this crazy idea, and now I'm drinking wine out of it. That's great. So I think that that's where I want to connect with the citizen as a person. And even if I don't know who the maker is, or I can't remember who it is, I somehow feel a connection because I got part of what they put their heart and soul in. And I feel that that's pretty exciting for me.
Wow. And Natali, would you agree with that perspective?
Absolutely. And as a maker, I see myself as participating in something that's a primary function of my humanity in these acts of making. And so I think back to what Hilary was saying about storytelling and about being able to arrange objects in a way that tell not only a part about our humanity, but also a part of those individual people. And for me, citizenship is about participating wholeheartedly in something, and wholeheartedly in something that I think is so vitally important.
Oh, that's beautiful. So I also want to talk a little bit about the benefits of surrounding yourself with that kind of community, and with that, surrounding yourself with craft. The benefits of that, whether it's in the home or the studio or the workplace, by creating spaces that incorporate craft and by engaging with it, how does that make living or working environments more enriching or effective? And I would just give one example that I read recently. There was a study from the University of Sheffield in the UK that compared patients who were recovering in an older, outdated hospital ward that didn't incorporate any kind of visual art or cultural perspective. It was just a building, and it was a little bit run down, I would say. And then they compared that with patients who were recovering in a newer ward that incorporated art into their hospital surroundings. So the patients in the ward with art, they were released on average 2 days earlier, and they required less pain medication than those who were in the older ward that didn't incorporate that. So that just goes to show a tiny piece of a very, very large web altogether in our whole experience from the health perspective, that, having visual art incorporated into your space, it improves people's health. It saves money for the healthcare system because you have people being discharged earlier. And it improves the working environment for everyone who's employed at the hospital, which allows them to do their jobs even better. So there's just so many good things that can come out of that. And I think that's a healthcare or a hospital specific perspective, but all home studios and workplaces can benefit from having that connection to the creative. So, Hilary, with your background working in finance and in the corporate world, where culture and specifically craft, they're not necessarily always top of mind, what impact do you feel that engagement with the arts can have on either these workplaces or these communities?
Well, I completely agree that I'm not surprised actually from the idea that the hospital people or patients are released more early, because just going back to the grave goods concept is people are attached to stuff. People like things from time immemorial. And so when there's something to think about, even if they don't like it, there's something to think about and like have opinions about and say, well, what do I think about this? But from a commercial point of view, from what I think a business perspective, is I feel that the business community, I would like to see more and more of it. I've been talking to different people, and I think a little bit is coming there. Because artists, particularly makers, they have to figure things out from the ground up. In other words, they went from nothing to a something. And they come up with crazy ideas or things which are really different. Like I've looked at Natalie's work and you think, well, who thinks about these things? And why would you put these things together? And yet there's an interesting idea. So now here we are at the fourth industrial revolution, where people are saying in business, we don't have enough creative thinkers. We don't have enough innovation. We have to have people who think differently. And they're like saying sleep more, rest, exercise, whatever. But the point is that don't ignore the creative class, because as soon as you see something which is made and which can be intriguing and that there's a curiosity, doesn't say that you have to make that. That means that you see there is something beyond what you've already thought about, something that you can have a spark come into you. And so when you're trying to resolve some of your own business questions or issues, that you can look to some of those things and say, wow, that's really different. I can't imagine what that is. And even if you don't like it, you go, how did they manage to suspend that cement thing from the ceiling and make it look so effortless? There's so many opportunities to see what is possible by looking at original art, and real, and like not just prints and not things only with inspirational sayings or weird stuff like that, because nobody goes deep on that. Mm-hmm. But you can look into a painting. I know Deloitte Canada has got paintings all across the country, and they've invested a lot in art and actually also in craft and in made things, so that people can look at those things, whether they realize it or not, and suddenly maybe connect in a very organic way, in a molecule by molecule way of saying, oh, there's something original. Maybe I can be original within my field of expertise.
Definitely. Natalie, what do you think about that?
So I think the importance of surrounding oneself with objects, and I was going to say beautiful objects, but that's not really always necessarily true. If I think about fine arts and crafted things, what they bring is a moment of nonverbal communication. Through some of those formal relationships of space and rhythm and mass and light, we're able to communicate to one another these sometimes very abstract and sometimes esoteric ideas. And it is kind of a slow space, and it slows your thinking down a little bit so that you actually have to parse out and think about something that is that might be outside of your own personal realm of understanding. The other thing is that those objects are, by their very nature, they explore the undiscovered country. As a maker, this is what I think about. When I'm making something, I'm colliding some very disparate ideas together into the material, into the glass object. And I do that through a kind of act of cartography, right? And by that, I mean, I'm going into a place that maybe someone has never actually been or thought about. And it's in that sort of undiscovered country that the objects arise or come into being. And so when you have that in your own space, if you have bought a piece that calls to you and calls to you in a way that you can't initially put your finger on, you can't describe what it is, I think it enriches your space. It gives you a place that is either sort of utopic, where you look at it and you sort of parse it out in your mind and you think about what it might mean, or it's heterotropic, where you can use it and use your hands and your eyes, and in some cases your mouth, to sort of understand what that object is. And those kinds of experiences are less and less every day as we start to move more and more into a digital world.
Hilary mentioned that fourth industrial revolution and how we're kind of disconnecting and you're at the same time more connected and less connected through that digital experience.
Exactly. But what happens with your hands and with your brain is when you're holding something, or you're making something, or you're just using your hands to understand the world, it changes how your memory works, and it changes how your brain works, and it actually changes how it opens up a door to other possibilities. And it's anyway, I could go on and on about computers and memory, but I won't bore everyone.
Well, you did touch a little bit on the idea of, why you connect or why you react to pieces. Yeah. And one of you mentioned that, it doesn't necessarily have to be beautiful. It can be a question, whether you like it or don't like it. You're still asking those questions and digging a little deeper. So, Hilary, I want to ask, from your perspective as a collector, what are those things that intrigue you when you do make a purchase, when you add to your own personal collection? What are the questions that you like to explore, or what pieces, or maybe you can tell us about a specific example of a specific piece that you just couldn't walk away from?
There's so many of them. Thank you. Actually, all I'm saying is that I go and see different pieces of work, and I want to value and recognize how important they can be, whether I like them or not. But I surround myself with things that I like. I'm not putting out any challenge pieces. I've got to say, the work of Lisa Kresge absolutely blows my mind, because she comes up with the most amazing, but definitely magical things. Like, there's this bowl that I got, or this statue, I don't know, called the diving horse. And she took it from a piece of history from Toronto, while she's from Chelsea, Quebec. And it's like, I guess they had it at the exhibition, and there was this horse that dove off, and I'm just getting goosebumps thinking about it. And so I've got the horse, and it's diving into this theater, this ceramic theater. Or she's done all these other things where I just can't even believe it, like the shapes of the moon, and how she works with the seasons and things. And I cannot walk away from a lot of Lisa stuff. She did a boxer, and the boxer actually is based on Gaetan Hart. She did a whole thing, and it's got like 4 or 5 arms, basically, to show the speed. It's so compelling. I just love it. So those are the things. I don't even know. It's just something fires in my brain, and I just go nuts, and I can't help it. I just can't help it. I have no good thoughts. I mean, I can't explain it. I mean, walking by something, I'm looking over at some things that I got in Paris a little while ago, about 2 years ago. And it's like, I walked by and I didn't see a thing. And all of a sudden I'm getting whiplash. Like, all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I see these little weird house things. I'm like, oh my goodness. And the next thing you know, like, I'm pounding, going, where is this stuff? Where is it? What's going on? I can't help it. I just like that.
It calls to you. It really, really does. I can completely relate to the connection to Lisa Kresge's work specifically. I also have a small piece of hers in my own personal collection, and I picked it up at LA Pie Gallery in Ottawa, and I'd actually been there and seen this piece. It's a small, well, not too small, a typical vase-sized piece of ceramic, and it is in the shape of, and very painterly style, of a squirrel. And I saw it, and I didn't get it that day, and I thought about it, and it just stuck in my mind. And I thought to myself, a couple months later, I was back in Ottawa, and I thought, if it's there, I've got to have it. And I went in and thank goodness it was still there, because that is a rare opportunity. If anyone out there listening to this podcast right now is considers yourself a collector or are thinking about starting to collect, when you get that zing that you just described, Hilary, you should really grab it up, because you never know if you will or will not have the opportunity to get that piece again. I was lucky with that Lisa Kresge squirrel vase. I could easily have gone back and not had it and just been, devastated for the rest of my life, frankly.
It's true. It's true. Yeah.
So Natali, is there anything in your own collection or as an artist who has sold work to collectors that you've had an experience, a unique experience like that?
Yeah. I worked at a gallery for a couple of years called Starfish, and it was in Victoria, and it was a glass gallery, and it was pretty much the only gallery that was dealing solely with Canadian glass. Mm-hmm. And I had some work in there, and there was this little girl, she must have been about 13 or 14, and she and her mom came to the gallery every Saturday. And her mom was trying to instill in her this sort of love of the handmade and of art and an appreciation of those things. And after about 6 months, she came and bought one of my pieces. It was one of my production pieces, and she had saved for 3 months to be able to purchase it. And that to me was, and I'm still so moved that her very first piece was something that I made, and that she sort of had this connection to this object, because she would come into the gallery and sort of walk around with it in her hand. And because it was a production piece, the original one had sold, but she still, so that for me was a deeply moving moment.
Wow.
When my pieces call in that way that Hilary says, that something sparks in someone else's brain, and they feel called to buy it or own it or have it as part of their life. For me, that's the moment that I know that whatever crazy path I've been on to make it has been worthwhile, and that I have achieved what I'd hoped.
Wow. And I think that really speaks to what you were talking about before, in that imbued humanity in each piece. And when we're connecting and collecting and experiencing each other's work, that is that human connection through craft.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Wow. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I really, really want to thank you both for being a big part of it. I'd like to shift gears for our one final segment before we wrap for today. If you've been listening to the previous versions of the podcast, you'll know that we are starting or working with our rapid fire segment. It's called the Slow Craft Lightning Round. So what I'm going to do is ask you each a series of questions, and your task is to provide quick and direct answers as fast as you can. So just your gut reaction is perfect. So I'll ask the question, and we'll go to Natali first, and then Hilary, if you want to follow up with your answer immediately after. Is everybody ready?
Yeah.
I'll try and keep it short.
Okay. So 1, 2, 3, here we go. Where did you grow up, and where do you live now?
I grew up in a whole bunch of different places, but mostly Edmonton, and I live in Calgary now.
I grew up all over Canada, including the Rock, the Middle East, and now I live in Toronto.
Lovely. Where and what did you study in school?
I did 2 degrees. I did my undergraduate in glass at the Alberta College of Art and Design, and I did my graduate degree at the Australian National University, and my graduate degree was all about pilgrimage, liminal space, and transformative experience.
I went to Laurier for archaeology, and then I went back to Laurier and I got a diploma in business administration.
Do you have a favorite tool?
It's the belt sander.
A pen.
What was your most recent craft purchase?
I bought a tablecloth by Natali Gerber.
I bought a whole bunch of stuff from the Gardner Museum of Lisa Kresge's.
What is one piece that you wish you had made yourself?
I think it's anything that Deb Jones has made in Australia. Every time I start looking at making a new body of work, I have to check out to make sure that she hasn't already made it.
For me, any of it. Anything.
What is your favorite quote, Natali?
I sleep, but my heart is awake.
Mine is from Alfred, King of Wessex, and it's Ride Forth Singing.
Lovely. What is your greatest weakness?
Do I really want to share that out loud?
I suppose it depends on what the weakness is, right?
Sometimes I can procrastinate.
Oh, for me, it's art, because I have friends who've got galleries and they say, "Are you sure you should be here?" It's like having an addict and this is crack cocaine.
Oh my.
Seriously.
If you had not chosen the career that you are in now or that you had worked in, what would you have been?
If I had the aptitude for it, a mathematician or an archaeologist.
I would be involved more with the music business.
Who had the greatest influence on you?
Oh, my mother.
My aunt.
And then last question, what do you wish more people understood about craft?
How joyous it is.
All right, I have a slightly longer answer. I feel that people really need to understand that it's not just the emotion that they get when they see something that they love, that there's this huge discipline and work that goes with it. And I think that that's why sometimes art and craft is undervalued, because they just go, "Oh, isn't that wonderful? It's so ephemeral." And they just thinking about it from an emotional perspective, as opposed to this was work. This is work. You had to go to college to do this. You have to do so much work to be able to create something which looks like it just arrived immaculately perfect. That's what I wish people understood.
Right. That signals the end of the lightning round. I feel like that was a really great ending and deserved a little bit of a bell ring. So that's it for the lightning round. Thank you so much for playing along. And this brings us almost to the end of our time together. So thank you both so much for being here and for having this conversation with us. I think we've really touched on a lot of really interesting things in this episode. I want to end today just by giving you, our listeners, a chance to hear about what you are up to next. So what's coming up on the horizon for you, Natali?
I was lucky enough to have a sabbatical, and I've been working with the material and experiences that I gathered on that trip. And so I was able to go to Hawaii, to Volcano National Park, and Uluru in Australia, and sort of compare the two sites through the lens of both the liminal, but also through that moment of creation. And so that work is ongoing, and I'm pretty close to getting ready to actually make larger objects. I've been doing a lot of drawing and a lot of maquette making, and I'm now ready to actually make the big things.
Oh, exciting. And Hilary, what's coming up for you, or do you have a special goal that you're working towards?
Well, I've just started my first year of 3 as an Iyengar yoga teacher trainee. So I have a long road ahead. And so there's something like that. Then I like to write articles in LinkedIn a lot about art and the sorts of things that we've been talking about here. I want to wedge my toe into Susan Collette's studio and see what she's paying attention to. And then go to lots of different wonderful artistic events that are around here, including actually there's a Citizens of Craft show. I think it's next weekend here in Toronto.
Lovely. Wonderful. Now, is there anything else that you wanted to say? Is there anything else that you wanted to share with the Citizens of Craft podcast community?
Just get out there. Just get out there and look at the stuff.
I have to agree with Hilary. Get out there and talk to people. Make sure that you push yourself into that wonderful community that we have as makers and thinkers and doers.
Today's episode of the Citizens of Craft podcast has been made possible through funding from the Canada Council for the Arts and with the support of the many members of the Canadian Crafts Federation. Thank you to the artists who shared their thoughts and their time with us today, and thanks to all of you out there who took the time to listen. Continue the conversation online and see work from today's guests on the Canadian Crafts Federation Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram accounts. While you're out there on the web, be sure to visit citizensofcraft.ca. There you'll see the profiles of over 600 professional craft artists. You can search by artist, medium, and location, even your own postal code, to connect with artists where they live and work across the country. Are you a maker? A lover of all things craft? Want to make a local connection? Look up your provincial or territorial craft council today. and join us next time on the Citizens of Craft podcast. Until then, craft on.